but where the means to purchase were absent. There was no kingdom of southern and central Europe to which these missionaries did not find their way, and where they did not leave traces of their visit in the disciples whom they made. On the west, they penetrated into Spain. In southern France, they found congenial fellow laborers in the Waldenses, by whom the seeds of truth were plentifully scattered over Dauphine and Languedoc. On the east, descending the Rhine and the Danube, they leavened Germany, Bohemia, and Poland with their doctrines, their track being marked with the edifices for worship and the stakes of martyrdom that arose around their steps. Even the seven-hilled city they feared not to enter, scattering the seed on ungenial soil, if perchance some of it might take root and grow. Their naked feet and coarse woolen garments made them somewhat marked figures in the streets of a city that clothed itself in purple and fine linen, and when their real errand was discovered, as sometimes chanced, the rulers of Christendom took care to further in their own way the springing of the seed by watering it with the blood of the men who had sowed it. The Paulicians in the west were called by several names, but the one by which they were most generally known is Cathari, the pure ones. In the knowledge of the Scriptures, their pure Christian lives and missionary zeal, these were not surpassed even by the Waldenses. They were mostly simple folk, industrious peasants and mechanics, who felt the evils around them and welcomed any change. The theologians who combated them ridiculed them as ignorant churls, and in France they were popularly known as texerant, weavers, on account of the prevalence of the heresy among the weavers, whose monotonous occupation doubtless gave ample opportunity for thought. Rude and ignorant they might be for the most part, but they had skilled theologians for teachers, and an extensive popular literature which has utterly perished, saving a Catharan version of the New Testament in romance and a book of ritual. Their familiarity with Scripture is vouched for by the warning of Lucas, Bishop of Ty, that the Christian should dread their conversation as he would a tempest, unless he is deeply skilled in the law of God, so that he can overcome them in argument. Their proselytizing zeal was especially dreaded. No labor was too severe, no risks too great, to deter them from spreading the faith which they deemed essential to salvation. Missionaries wandered over Europe through strange lands to carry the glad tidings to benighted populations, regardless of hardship, and undeterred by the fate of their brethren, whom they saw expiate at the stake the hardihood of their revolt. Like the Waldenses, these traveled also as peddlers and artisans, at times changing their occupations and their manner of dress, the better to avoid detection. As they traveled, they would leave with the people where they could safely do so, or scatter by the wayside brief writings containing portions of Scripture, with expressions of their own of Christian thought. These were picked up by the shepherds or the wayfarers, and so were the means by which salvation reached many souls. Those who could not read well would take the leaflets to the priests for an explanation, and in the interpreting of these writings to the unlearned ones, the light of the truth reached many of the priests who themselves gladly bore the guilt of heresy. Thus, while the papacy was climbing her bloody way to the headship of all the kingdoms of the world, Christianity was silently and gradually permeating society throughout all of those very kingdoms. And when the papacy had attained to that height of dominion at which she beheld at her feet all kingdoms, and was ready to congratulate herself that all opposition was entirely subdued, she was compelled to awake to the fact that here was a power which, more than any she had ever yet met, threatened her supremacy. It is true the Christians had not been wholly ignored by the papacy. Some of the popes had been obliged to notice an occasional arch-heretic. There had been comparatively a few local burnings of heretics. But to the papacy, all these were but mere passing incidents, calling for hardly more than a mere glance as she pursued her ambitious way to the high goal which she had in view. But now, having attained that goal, she found that all the power of which she was by all means possessed must be exercised not merely to maintain herself at the height of power which she had gained, but to maintain her very existence. Northern Italy and southern France formed the general region in which were clustered the centers of all these Christians. The mountains and valleys of Piedmont were the center of the Waldenses. Albi in southern France was the center of the Cathari, Petrobrucians, Henricians, all of whom were included in the one name of Albigenses. And though in the papal decrees many names are sometimes used, yet generally speaking all these are referred to by the papacy under the two designations of heretics and Waldensies, the word heretics invariably referring to the Cathari or Albigenses, and charges against all are summed up in the words heresy and Waldensianism. In 1045, the Bishop of Chalon applied to Bishop Watso of Liege for advice as to what he had better do with the Cathari, who were multiplying in his diocese, whether the secular arm should be called in to prevent the leaven from corrupting the whole people. Bishop Watso replied that they should be left to God, for the reason that those whom the world now regards as tares may be garnered by him as wheat when comes the harvest time. Those whom we deem the adversaries of God, he may make superior to us in heaven. However, there were exceedingly few prelates like Bishop Watso of Liege. Through this century, there were not a few Christians put to death in different countries, but so far the persecution was not systematic, nor was it directed by specific acts either of states or of the Church. Individual popes and individual kings ordered it in cases of arch-heretics, or it was accomplished through the fanatical wrath of the local populace. But in the 12th century, all the power of both church and state was brought to bear to accomplish the death of heretics. In 1139, by the Second General Lateran Council, Pope Innocent II issued a decisive decree, which is interesting as the earliest example of the interpellation of the secular arm. Not only were the Cathari condemned and expelled from the Church, but the temporal authorities were ordered to coerce them and all those who favored or defended them. This policy was followed up in 1148 by the Council of Rheims, which forbade anyone to receive or maintain on his lands the heretics dwelling in Gascony, Provence, and elsewhere, and not to afford them shelter in passing or give them a refuge under pain of excommunication and interdict. When Alexander III was exiled from Rome by Frederick Barbarossa and his antipope Victor, and came to France, he called in 1163 a great council at Tours. It was an imposing assemblage, comprising 17 cardinals, 124 bishops, including Thomas Becket, and hundreds of abbots, besides hosts of other ecclesiastics and a vast number of laymen. This august body, after performing its first duty of anathematizing the rival pope, proceeded to deplore the heresy which, arising in the Toulousian, had spread like a cancer throughout Gascony, deeply infecting the faithful everywhere. The prelates of those regions were ordered to be vigilant in suppressing it by anathematizing all who should permit heretics to dwell on their lands or should hold intercourse with them, in buying or selling, so that, being cut off from human society, they might be compelled to abandon their errors. All secular princes, moreover, were commanded to imprison them and to confiscate their property. By this time it is evident that heresy was no longer concealed, but displayed itself openly and defiantly, and the futility of the papal commands at Tours to cut heretics off from human intercourse was shown 2 years later at the council or rather colloquy, of Lumbers near Albi. This was a public disputation between representatives of orthodoxy and the Boshoms Boscrestius, or good men, as they styled themselves, before judges, agreed upon by both sides, in the presence of Pons, Archbishop of Narbonne, and sundry bishops beside the most powerful nobles of the region. Constance, sister of King Louis VII and wife of Raymond of Toulouse, Trencavel of Béziers, Sicard of Lautry, and others. Nearly all of the population of Lumbers and Albi assembled, and the proceedings were evidently regarded as of the greatest public interest and importance. A full report of the discussion, including the decision against the Cathari, has reached us from several orthodox sources, but the only interest which the affair has is its marked significance in showing that heresy had fairly outgrown all the means of repression at command of the local churches, that reason had to be appealed to in place of force, that heretics had no scruple in manifesting and declaring themselves, and that the Catholic disputants had to submit to their demands in citing only the New Testament as an authority. The powerlessness of the Church was still further exhibited in the fact that the Council, after its argumentative triumph, was obliged to content itself with simply ordering the nobles of Lumbers to no longer protect the heretics. What satisfaction Pons of Narbonne found the next year in confirming the conclusions of the Council of Lumbers in a council held at Kobstang, it would be difficult to define. So great was the prevailing demoralization that when some monks of the strict Cistercian order left their monastery of Villemain near Agde and publicly took wives, he was unable to punish this gross infraction of their vows, and the interposition of Alexander III was invoked, probably without result. Evidently the Church was powerless. When it could condemn the doctrines and not the persons of heretics, it confessed to the world that it possessed no machinery capable of dealing with opposition on a scale of such magnitude. The nobles and the people were indisposed to do its bidding, and without their aid the fulmination of its anathema was an empty ceremony. The Cathari saw this plainly, and within 2 years of the Council of Lumbers they dared, in 1167, to hold a council of their own at St. Felix de Caraman, near Toulouse. Their highest dignitary, Bishop Nicetas, came from Constantinople to preside, with deputies from Lombardy. The French Church was strengthened against the modified dualism of the Concorazin school. Bishops were elected for the vacant sees of Toulouse, Val d'Aran, Carcassonne, Albi, and France north of the Loire, the latter being Robert de Sperron, subsequently a refugee in Lombardy, where he gave his name to the sect of the Speronistae. Commissioners were named to settle a disputed boundary between the sees of Toulouse and Carcassonne. In short, the business was that of an established and independent church, which looked upon itself as destined to supersede the Church of Rome. Based upon the affection and reverence of the people, which Rome had forfeited, it might well look forward to ultimate supremacy. In fact, its progress during the next 10 years was such as to justify the most enthusiastic hopes. Raymond of Toulouse, whose power was virtually that of an independent sovereign, adhered to Frederick Barbarossa, acknowledged the antipope Victor and his successors, and cared nothing for Alexander III, who was received by the rest of France, and the Church, distracted by the schism, could offer little opposition to the development of heresy. In England, in 1166, 30 Cathari who had fled from persecution in Flanders were arrested. King Henry II called a council of bishops at Oxford and presided over it to determine their faith. They openly avowed it, and were condemned to be scourged, branded in the face with a key, and driven forth. The importance which Henry attached to the matter is shown by his devoting soon after, in the Assizes of Clarendon, an article to the subject forbidding anyone to receive them under penalty of having his house torn down, and requiring all sheriffs to swear to the observance of the law, and to make all stewards of the barons and all knights and frank tenants swear likewise, the first secular law on the subject in any statute book since the fall of Rome. In 1177, however, Alexander III triumphed and received the submission of Frederick. Raymond necessarily followed his suzerain. A large portion of his territories was subject to the empire, and suddenly awoke to the necessity of arresting the progress of heresy. Powerful as he was, he felt himself unequal to the task. The burgesses of his cities, independent and intractable, were for the most part Cathari. A large portion of his knights and gentlemen were secretly or avowedly protectors of heresy. The common people throughout his dominions despised the clergy and honored the heretics. When a heretic preached, they crowded to listen and applaud. When a Catholic assumed the rare function of religious instruction, they jeered at him and asked him what he had to do with proclaiming the Word of God. In a state of chronic war with powerful vassals and more powerful neighbors like the kings of Aragon and England, it was manifestly impossible for Raymond to undertake the extermination of a half or more than half of his subjects. In 1178, Pope Alexander III, in publishing the call to the Third Council of the Lateran, mentioned as one of the subjects for the consideration of the council the tares which choke the wheat and must be pulled up by the roots. And by that council, in 1179, there was issued the following decree: The Church, as the holy Leo saith, whilst it rejects bloody executions from its code of morals, does not omit them in practice, because the fear of corporal punishments sometimes causes sinners to recur to spiritual remedies. Thus, the heretics who are called Catharines, Paterins, or Publicans are so strongly fortified in Gascony among the Waldensies and in the territory of Toulouse that they no longer conceal themselves, but openly teach their errors. It is on that account we anathematize them as well as those who grant them an asylum or protection, and if they die in their sin, we prohibit oblations being made for them, or sepulture being granted to them. As for the Brabancons, Aragoneses, Navarrese, Basques, Cotterels, and Tribecans, who respect neither churches nor monasteries, who spare neither widow nor orphan, nor age nor sex, and who pillage plains and cities, we also order those who shall receive, protect, or lodge them to be denounced and excommunicated in all the churches at the solemn feasts, nor do we permit them to be absolved until after they shall have taken up arms against these abominable Waldensies. We also declare the faithful who are bound to them by any treaties to be entirely free from their oaths, and we enjoin on them for the remission of their sins to be wanting in faith to these execrable heretics, to confiscate their goods, reduce them to slavery, and put to death all who are unwilling to be converted. We grant to all Christians who shall take up arms against the Catharines the same indulgences as to the faithful who take the cross for the Holy Sepulchre. Immediately on his return from the council, Pons, Archbishop of Narbonne, made haste to publish this decree, with all its anathemas and interdicts. The Cardinal of Albano was forthwith sent as papal legate to preach and lead the crusade. His eloquence enabled him to raise a considerable force of horse and foot, with which in 1181 he fell upon the territories of the Viscount of Beziers and laid siege to the stronghold of Lavaur, where the Viscountess Adelaide, daughter of Raymond of Toulouse, and the leading Paterins had taken refuge. We are told that Lavaur was captured through a miracle, and that in various parts of France, consecrated wafers dropping blood announced the success of the Christian arms. The short term for which the Crusaders had enlisted expired, the army disbanded itself, and the next year the cardinal legate went back to Rome, having accomplished virtually nothing except to increase the mutual exasperation by the devastation of the country through which his troops had passed. Raymond of Toulouse, involved in desperate war with the King of Aragon, seems to have preserved complete indifference as to this expedition, taking no part in it on either side. In 1184, by a council held at Verona, Pope Lucius III confirmed the foregoing decree of Alexander III and sent forth a bull as follows: Ecclesiastical justice could not show too much rigor in annihilating the heresies which now multiply in a large number of the provinces. Already has Rome braved the thunders of the Holy See, and her intractable people have dared, from hatred of one person, to lay a sacrilegious hand upon our priests. But the day of vengeance is preparing, and until we can return to those Romans the evils they have inflicted on us, we excommunicate all heretics, whatever may be their appellation. Among others, the Catharines, the Paterins, those who falsely call themselves the humiliated, or the poor of Lyon, as well as the Papacies, the Josephines, the Arnaudists, and finally all those wretches who call themselves Vaudois, or enemies of the Holy See. We strike these abominable sectarians with a perpetual anathema. We condemn those who shall give them shelter or protection to the same penalties, and who shall call themselves consoled, perfect believers, or by any other superstitious name. And as the severity of ecclesiastical discipline is sometimes despised and powerless, we order that those who shall be convicted of favoring heretics, if they are clergy or monks, shall be despoiled of their sacerdotal functions and of their benefices, and shall be abandoned to all the rigors of secular justice. If laymen, we order that they suffer the most horrid tortures, be proved by fire and sword, torn by stripes, and burned alive. We add, by advice of the bishops, and on the remonstrances of the emperor and the lords, that every prelate shall visit several times during the year, either in person or by his archdeacon, all the cities of his diocese, and particularly the places in which he shall judge that the heretics hold their assemblies. They shall cause the inhabitants, and especially the old men, women, and children, to be seized. They shall interrogate them to know if there are any Vaudois in their country, or people who hold secret assemblies, and who lead a life differing from that of the faithful. Those who shall hesitate to make denunciations shall be immediately put to the torture. When the bishop or archdeacon shall discover the guilty, he shall cause them to be arrested, and shall exact from them an abjuration, or, in their refusal, shall execute the sentence we have pronounced. We order besides the counts, barons, rectors, and consuls of cities and other places to engage by oath, in accordance with the warning of the bishops, to persecute heretics and their accomplices, when they shall be so required to do by the Church, and to execute with all their power all that the Holy See and the Empire have appointed in regard to the crimes of heresy. Otherwise we declare them deprived of their offices and dignities, without the power ever again to hold any employment, and moreover they shall be excommunicated forever, and their property placed under interdict. The cities which shall resist our orders, or which, having been warned by the bishops, shall neglect to pursue the heretics, shall be excluded from all commerce with other cities, and shall lose their rank and privileges. The citizens shall be excommunicated, noted with perpetual infamy, and as such declared unfit to fill any public or ecclesiastical function. All the faithful shall have the right to kill them, seize their goods, and reduce them to slavery. This bull had so little practical effect that the condemnation had to be repeated by the same pope, at a council held at Narbonne in the same year. And even this was so little effective that the poor men of Lyon, of the Waldenses, agreed about 1190 to take the chances of a disputation held in the cathedral of Narbonne with Raymond of Daventry, a religious and God-fearing Catholic, as judge. Of course, the decision went against them, and of course they were as little inclined as before to submit, but the colloquy has an interest as showing what progress at that period they had made in dissidence from Rome. The 6 points on which the argument was held were, first, that they refused obedience to the authority of pope and prelate; second, that all, even laymen, can preach; third, that according to the apostles, God is to be obeyed rather than man; fourth, that women may preach; fifth, that masses, prayers, and alms for the dead are of no avail, with the addition that some of them denied the existence of purgatory; and sixth, that prayer in bed or in a chamber or in a stable is as efficacious as in a church. Good prelates, they held, who led apostolic lives, were to be obeyed, and to them alone was granted the power to bind and loose, which was striking a mortal blow at the whole organization of the Church. Merit, and not ordination, conferred the power to consecrate and bless, to bind and to loose. Everyone, therefore, who led an apostolic life had this power, and as they assumed that they all led such a life, it followed that they, although laymen, could execute all the functions of the priesthood. It likewise followed that the ministrations of sinful priests were invalid, though at first the French Waldenses were not willing to admit this, while the Italians boldly affirmed it. A further error was that confession to a layman was as efficacious as to a priest, which was a serious attack upon the sacrament of penitence, though as yet the Fourth Council of Lateran had not made priestly confession indispensable, and Alain is willing to admit that in the absence of a priest, confession to laymen is sufficient. The system of indulgences was another of the sacerdotal devices which they rejected, and added 3 specific rules of morality which became distinctive characteristics of the sect. Every lie is a mortal sin. Every oath, even in a court of justice, is unlawful, and homicide is under no circumstances to be permitted, whether in war or in execution of judicial sentences. This necessarily involved non-resistance, rendering the Waldensies dangerous only from such moral influence as they could acquire. Even as late as 1217, a well-informed contemporary assures us that the 4 chief errors of the Waldensies were their wearing sandals after the fashion of the apostles, their prohibition of oaths and of homicide, and their assertion that any member of the sect, if he wore sandals, could, in case of necessity, consecrate the Eucharist. All this was a simple-hearted endeavor to obey the commands of Christ and make the gospel an actual standard for the conduct of family life. But these principles, if universally adopted, would have reduced the Church to a condition of apostolic poverty, and would have swept away much of the distinction between priest and layman. Besides, the sectaries were inspired with the true missionary spirit. Their proselytizing zeal knew no bounds. They wandered from land to land promulgating their doctrines, and finding everywhere a cordial response, especially among the lower classes, who were ready enough to embrace a dogma that promised to release them from the vices and oppressions of the clergy. We are told that one of their chief apostles carried with him various disguises, appearing now as a cobbler, then as a barber, and again as a peasant. And though this may have been, as alleged, for the purpose of eluding capture, it shows the social stratum to which their missions were addressed. The poor men of Lyon multiplied with incredible rapidity throughout Europe. The Church became seriously alarmed, and not without reason, for an ancient document of the sectaries shows a tradition among them that under Waldo, or immediately afterward, their councils had an average attendance of about 700 members present. The admitted failure of the Crusade of 1181 seems to have rendered the Church hopeless, for the time, of making headway against heresy. For a quarter of a century it was allowed to develop in comparative toleration throughout the territories of Gascony, Languedoc, and Provence. It is true that the decree of Lucius III, issued at Verona in 1184, is important as attempting the foundation of an organized inquisition, but it worked no immediate effect. It is true that in 1195 another papal legate, Michael, held a provincial council at Montpellier, where he commanded the enforcement of the Lateran canons on all heretics and Maenite or brigands whose property was to be confiscated and whose persons reduced to slavery. But all this fell dead upon the indifference of the nobles, who, involved in perpetual war with each other, preferred to risk the anathemas of the Church rather than to complicate their troubles by attempting the extermination of a majority of their subjects at the behest of a hierarchy which no longer inspired respect or reverence. Perhaps also the fall of Jerusalem in 1186, in arousing an unprecedented fervor of fanaticism, directed it toward Palestine, and left little for the vindication of the faith nearer home. Be this as it may, no effective persecution was undertaken until the vigorous ability of Innocent III, after vainly trying milder measures, organized overwhelming war against heresy. During this interval, the poor men of Lyon arose and were forced to make common cause with the Cathari. The proselytizing zeal which had been so successful in secrecy and tribulation had free scope for its development, and had no effective antagonism to dread from a negligent or disheartened clergy. The heretics preached and made converts, while the priests were glad if they could save a fraction of their tithes and revenues from rapacious nobles and rebellious or indifferent parishioners. Heresy throve accordingly. Innocent III admitted the humiliating fact that the heretics were allowed to preach and teach and make converts in public, and that unless speedy measures were taken for their suppression, there was danger that the infection would spread to the whole Church. William of Tudela says that the heretics possessed the Albigeois, the Carcasses, and the Larages, and that to describe them as numerous throughout the whole district from Béziers to Bordeaux is not saying enough. Walter Mapes asserts that there were none of them in Brittany, but that they abounded in Anjou, while in Aquitaine and Burgundy their number was infinite. William of Pye-Lorenz assures us that Satan possessed in peace the greater part of southern France. The clergy were so despised that they were accustomed to conceal the tonsure through very shame, and the bishops were obliged to admit to holy orders whoever was willing to assume them. The whole land, under a curse, produced nothing but thorns and thistles, ravishers and bandits, robbers, murderers, adulterers, and usurers. Caesarius of Heisterbach declares that the Albigensian errors increased so rapidly that they soon infected 1,000 cities, and he believes that if they had not been repressed by the sword of the faithful, the whole of Europe would have been corrupted. A German inquisitor informs us that in Lombardy, Provence, and other regions, there were more schools of heresy than of orthodox theology, with more scholars, that they disputed publicly and summoned the people to public debates, that they preached in the marketplaces, the fields, the houses, and that there were none who dared to interfere with them, owing to the multitude and power of their protectors. As we have seen, they were regularly organized in dioceses. They had their educational establishments for the training of women as well as men, and, at least in one instance, all the nuns of a convent embraced Catharism, without quitting the house or the habit of their order. Such was the position to which corruption had reduced the Church. Intent upon the acquisition of temporal power, it had well nigh abandoned its spiritual duties, and its empire, which rested on spiritual foundations, was crumbling with their decay and threatening to pass away like an unsubstantial vision. Then the Archpope Innocent III entered the lists to save the papacy. In his consecration sermon he announced that one of his principal duties would be the destruction of heresy, and of this he never lost sight to the end, amid his endless conflicts with emperors and princes. He was consecrated February 22, 1198, and as early as April 1st, he wrote to the Archbishop of Auch, deploring the spread of heresy and the danger of its becoming universal. The prelate and his brethren are ordered to extirpate it by the utmost rigor of ecclesiastical censors, and if necessary by bringing the secular arm to bear through the assistance of princes and people. Not only are heretics themselves to be punished, but all who have any dealings with them, or who are suspected by reason of undue familiarity with them. In the existing posture of affairs, the prelates to whom these commands were addressed can only have regarded them with mingled derision and despair, and we can readily imagine the replies in which they declared their zeal and lamented their powerlessness. Innocent probably was aware of this in advance, and did not await the response. By April 21, he had 2 commissioners ready to represent the Holy See on the spot, Rainier and Guy, whom he sent armed with letters to all the prelates, princes, nobles, and people of southern France, empowering them to enforce whatever regulations they might see fit to employ to avert the imminent peril to the Church arising from the countless increase of Cathari and Waldensies, who corrupted the people by simulated works of justice and charity. These heretics, who will not return to the true faith, are to be banished, and their property confiscated. These provisions are to be enforced by the secular authorities under penalty of interdict for refusal or negligence, and with the reward for obedience of the same indulgences as those granted for a pilgrimage to Rome or Compostela. And all who consort or deal with heretics, or show them favor or protection, are to share their punishment. In point of time, Innocent III had been a little forestalled by fierce persecutions in Spain. In 1194, the note of persecution was sounded by Alonso II of Aragon in an edict which is worthy of note as the first secular legislation, with the exception of the Assizes of Clarendon in the modern world against heresy. The Waldensies and all other heretics anathematized by the Church are ordered as public enemies to quit his dominions by the day after All Saints. Anyone who receives them to his hands, listens to their preaching, or gives them food shall incur the penalties of treason, with confiscation of all his goods and possessions. The decree is to be published by all pastors on Sundays, and all public officials are ordered to enforce it. Any heretic remaining after 3 days' notice of the law can be despoiled by anyone, and any injury inflicted on him short of death or mutilation, so far from being an offense, shall be regarded as meriting the royal favor. The ferocious atrocity of these provisions, which rendered the heretic an outlaw, which condemned him in advance, and which exposed him without a trial to the cupidity or malice of every man, was exceeded 3 years later by Alonso's son, Pedro II. In a national council of Girona in 1197, he renewed his father's legislation, added the penalty of the stake for the heretic. If any noble failed to eject these enemies of the Church, the officials and people of the diocese were ordered to proceed to his castle and seize them without responsibility for any damages committed, and anyone failing to join in the foray was subjected to the heavy fine of 20 pieces of gold to the royal fisc. Moreover, all officials were commanded within 8 days after summons to present themselves before their bishop or his representative and take an oath to enforce the law. And what were the crimes? What was the wickedness of the people who were thus to be hunted to death? By the testimony of Catholics themselves, the testimony of their persecutors, yea, the testimonies of the very inquisitors who tormented them to death, what were the crimes, what the wickedness of these who had incurred this flood of the wrath of Rome? We have seen that all the names of the Christians were summed up by the Papacy in the expression heresy and Waldensianism, and that the heresy was embraced under the general name of Albigenses. Of the Albigenses, or Cathari, St. Bernard, who was the principal preacher of one of the chief crusades against them, says, "If you interrogate them, nothing can be more Christian. As to their conversation, nothing can be less reprehensible, and what they speak they prove by deeds. As for the morals of the heretic, he cheats no one, he oppresses no one, he strikes no one. His cheeks are pale with fasting, he eats not the bread of idleness, his hands labor for his livelihood. As to rites and ceremonies, the Cathari cast aside all the machinery of the Church. The Roman Church indeed was the synagogue of Satan, in which salvation was impossible. Consequently, the sacraments, the sacrifices of the altar, the suffrages and interposition of the Virgin in saints, purgatory relics, images, crosses, holy water, indulgences, and the other devices by which the priest procured salvation for the faithful were rejected, as well as the tithes and oblations which rendered the procuring of salvation so profitable. Yet the Catharan Church, as the Church of Christ, inherited the power to bind and to loose, bestowed by Christ on his disciples. The consolamentum, or baptism of the Spirit, wiped out all sin, but no prayers were of use for the sinner who persisted in wrongdoing. Of the other class, those guilty of Waldensianism, an inquisitor who knew them well describes them. Heretics are recognizable by their customs and speech, for they are modest and well regulated. They take no pride in their garments, which are neither costly nor vile. They do not engage in trade to avoid lies and oaths and frauds, but live by their labor as mechanics. Their teachers are cobblers. They do not accumulate wealth, but are content with necessaries. They are chaste and temperate in meat and drink. They do not frequent taverns or dances or other vanities. They restrain themselves from anger. They are always at work. They teach and learn and consequently pray but little. They are to be known by their modesty and precision of speech, avoiding scurrility and detraction and light words and lies and oaths. But their crowning offense was their love and reverence for Scripture, and their burning zeal in making converts. The Inquisitor of Passau informs us that they had translations of the whole Bible in the vulgar tongue, which the Church vainly sought to suppress, and which they studied with incredible assiduity. He knew a peasant who could recite the book of Job word for word. Many of them had the whole of the New Testament by heart, and, simple as they were dangerous disputants. As for the missionary spirit, he tells of one who, on a winter night, swam the river Ips to gain a chance of converting a Catholic, and all, men and women, old and young, were ceaseless in learning and teaching. After a hard day's labor, they would devote the night to instruction. They sought the lazar houses to carry salvation to the leper. A disciple of 10 days' standing would seek out another whom he could instruct, And when the dull and untrained brain would fain abandon the task in despair, they would speak words of encouragement. Learn a single word a day. In a year you will know 300, and thus you will gain in the end. Such is the general testimony, and the tales which were told as to the sexual abominations customary among them may safely be set down as devices to excite popular detestation, grounded possibly on extravagances of asceticism, such as were common among the early Christians. For the Waldenses held that connubial intercourse was only lawful for the procurement of offspring. An inquisitor admits his disbelief as to these stories, for which he had never found a basis worthy of credence. That horrible tales were concocted to excite popular detestation can be easily understood from the fact that the Brabancons, Aragonses, Navarrese, Basques, Cotterels, Tribecans named in the decree of Alexander III against the heretics were simply freebooters, composed of fugitives from serfdom, outlaws, escaped criminals, worthless ecclesiastics, outcast monks, who preyed upon the community in bands of varying size. The chronicles of the times are full of lamentations over their incessant devastations. And yet, in that decree, the Catharines, Paterins, and the Albigenses are classed with them in the same decree of excommunication and condemnation. Yet even in that same decree, the freebooters are more favored than are the Christians. For while for the Christians there is no sort of favor announced, for the freebooters there is absolution after they shall have taken up arms against these abominable Albigenses. Surely, if ever there was a God-fearing people, it was these unfortunates under the ban of church and state, whose secret passwords were, "Se dit Saint Paul, no mentir." St. Paul says, "Do not lie." "Se dit Saint Jacques, ne jure." St. James says, "Do not swear." "Se dit Saint Pierre, ne rend mal pour mal, mais bien contraire." St. Peter says, "Do not render evil for evil, but contrariwise good." The Noble Liaison scarce says more than the Inquisitors, when it bitterly declares that the sign of the Vaudois, deemed worthy of death, was that he followed Christ and sought to obey the commandments of God. Indeed, so thoroughly did the Papacy hate righteousness and love iniquity, that evil-doing was the merit that delivered from her condemnation. About 1220, a clerk of Spire, whose austerity subsequently led him to join the Franciscans, was only saved by the interposition of Conrad, afterward Bishop of Hildesheim, from being burned as a heretic because his preaching led certain women to lay aside their vanities of apparel and behave with humility. And when a certain Catholic, Jean Tessier, was by mistake cited before the tribunal of the Inquisition, amongst the proofs that he offered that he was not a heretic were, "I eat flesh, and lie, and swear, and am a faithful Christian." Thus the whole power of the Papacy was devoted to compelling mankind to sin. The actual work of crushing out all the good that was in the world, Innocent III was obliged to begin in Italy, and almost within the very borders of the papal territory. All the northern half of the peninsula, from the Alps to the patrimony of St. Peter, was honeycombed with it, and even as far south as Calabria it was to be found. When Innocent III in 1198 ascended the papal throne, he at once commenced active proceedings for its extermination, and the obstinacy of the heretics may be estimated by the struggle in Viterbo, a city subject to the temporal as well as spiritual jurisdiction of the Papacy. In March 1199, Innocent, stimulated by the increase of heresy and the audacity of its public display, wrote to the Viterbians, renewing and sharpening the penalties against all who received or favored heretics. Yet in spite of this, in 1205, the heretics carried the municipal election, electing as chamberlain a heretic under excommunication.